My last story is about symbolism. Specifically, it's about the symbol of localism. I guess you could say that this is a continuation of story one, that is to say, a story about regulatory paradigms. Symbols are a kind of paradigm, but they're a rather special kind because they derive their potency from vague and rather emotive, subjective ideas and suggestions rather than well-defined theories or models. A scientific paradigm can be tested, at least in principle, by its fit with reality. You can ask whether a market does present the characteristics of a natural monopoly. You can have a debate about whether it does or not. You can even have a debate whether or not that's the right question, but at least that debate occurs within a framework that is more or less objectively defined. When the paradigm rests on subjective ideals and aspirations, localism, the public interest, things like that, the debate about it is not so easily framed. And that is exactly what has happened with the debate over localism. Actually, I misspoke there. There is no debate about localism. It's just always been a kind of accepted thing. I mentioned earlier that localism has had a pervasive influence in mass media policies. The cable regulation story I just related is such a story. It is all about protecting localism. That was the core concern of cable regulation. Protect the local broadcasters because that would protect the localism. More recently, localism was a major element of the ICC's decision to retain a cap on the number of broadcast stations that can be owned by a single entity. The basic logic here was if you lift the cap, the networks will gobble up too many of the local stations. If they gobble up too many of the local stations, they will no longer be dependent upon the independently owned stations. To clear their programming, they'll have greater leverage in clearing network programming of their choice, and that will therefore undermine localism. More importantly, localism has been the core rationale for spectrum policies, and this is the story that I want to tell. It really begins, for all practical purposes, in 1952 with the table of television allotments. The table of television allotments in 1952, which we're still operating basically within the same framework, was designed so that the number of television services available to households was deliberately constrained by purpose of providing as many communities as possible with a local station. It worked this way. There are competing priorities. There was a priority of giving everyone at least one service. And then when that service was fulfilled, that mandate was fulfilled, then try to give every community a local station. And then go back and try to give it the second service, and then the second, and all that. So it's competing priorities anymore. The effect of the second priority, however, was put a very substantial constraint on the number of services that could be received. What it meant is that in all but the largest metropolitan areas of New York, there was a significant constraint on the number of services that the television households could receive in order to make room for the local allotments to places like Farmville, Virginia. Population 6,800 in 2000. The purpose of this design, of course, was to facilitate local outlets, local services. But since the effect of this was to allocate, in many cases, a lot of channels to towns too small to operate them, Farmville, let alone too small to originate local programming, it was simply waste. The channels ended up being simply warehoused. A further effect of this localism design was to place a constraint on the number of national networks, which in turn meant the number of national program sources. For national networks to be competitive with one another, they each have to reach a national audience. But in those days, the only way they could reach that audience was, of course, through the medium of the local broadcast stations. So any limitation on the number of local outlets that could be supported arising from this priority scheme meant a limitation on the national networks. which is why for most of our history we only had 3 national networks, now we have 4. Now all of this you'll say, oh, this is just ancient history, really doesn't matter. And I guess it doesn't, in the sense that now we have multi-channel broadband media with just a plenitude of channels, more than 100 in most households. This is all a thing of the past, right? Yes, it is, in a way, but now it's the emergence of those same media that has exposed a new and larger form of spectrum waste. The question today is not whether we're wasting the channels by allotting them to Farmville. The question is whether we are wasting channels, spectrum, by allocating it to television broadcasting at all. In 2009, the Nielsen company estimated that only 11% of television households depended upon over-the-air broadcasting. That's a percentage, by the way, that diminishes every year. What that means is that for the vast majority of Americans, local broadcasting has become simply a means of delivering a program content to the head end of a cable system or to the transponders of a satellite system, or maybe now to the head end of a telephone company like Verizon. It's a very costly scheme in terms of spectrum consumption. If we were to switch all distribution to cable or satellite or other broadband distribution, we could recapture nearly 300 megahertz worth of spectrum. And that would go a long way toward meeting the need created by the exponential growth in mobile wireless broadband service. However, and here's the big point, any suggestion that we might reallocate that broadband service, that spectrum to broadband wireless is quickly overwhelmed by 2 objections. One, it will deprive the remaining households of free television and undermine localism. Well, now take the first objection, free television. That has to be a loser going in, because with nearly 90% of American households paying for television, by what logic do we continue to insist on retaining free television for the 10, 11% that don't want to pay for it? No evidence exists, at least no evidence that I've seen, suggests that those households that depend on over-the-air broadcasting are poorer on average than those who subscribe to cable or satellite. But let's suppose they are. By what public policy logic do we insist that television is free when electric power and indoor plumbing are not? Something wrong here. The very idea of free television is misleading in this context. Viewers may not pay for it, but of course the public at large does. They pay for it in terms of the opportunity cost of having that spectrum devoted to that purpose rather than another purpose. If we had an open market in spectrum instead of our present very limited market in licenses, we would have a market that allows transfer of licenses but only within predefined categories within broadcasting set. If we had a more broad market for transfer, I think we would quickly learn that the allocation of these frequencies to broadcast service is not its highest value use. A recent economic study prepared for the Consumer Electronics Association concludes that reallocating the TV broadcast spectrum to mobile wireless would yield net financial benefits of between $48 and $51 billion. That's after calculating the value of the loss of the free television to the people who would lose it. Put differently, 48 to 51 billion is the gains from trade that could be realized if you allow broadcasters to get rid of all their spectrum and sell it to mobile wireless. That's just the direct cost of maintaining this spectrum allocation scheme. More generally, however, if you calculate the consumer surplus of this spectrum allocation, the same CEA study estimated that the value of the consumer surplus loss, that's the value that consumers would receive, that's the value that consumers of mobile wireless service would realized by having the spectrum used for that service rather than broadcasting, that value is anywhere between 500 billion and 1.2 trillion. Even in today's megabyte world, those are real dollars. As to the second reason for retaining spectrum-based television, preserving localism. Well, this reason presupposes that the local broadcast service requires over-the-air broadcasting, or the local program service requires over-the-air broadcasting. And of course it does not. We can very easily provide for local programming by cable or satellite. But even if we thought that broadcasters were sort of uniquely situated to create that programming, we could simply have them deliver it by shielded conduit to the cable head-end facilities or the satellite transponders, and instead of casting it willy-nilly out into space where it consumes all this valuable spectrum. I read recently, maybe some of you saw this as well, that the FCC is considering proposals to authorize broadcasters to sell their spectrum to mobile wireless providers. That would be eminently sensible. In fact, I think that would be an occasion for dancing in the streets. I don't see how they could possibly do it under the present statute. I think it would clearly require congressional authorization. As I read the statute, Section 301 would forbid that kind of transfer. I think it is unlikely, however, in any case, that the FCC would actually adopt such a proposal, at least on a wholesale basis. Conceivably, the agency might do a number of things. It might allow broadcasters to transfer some of their assigned spectrum, for example. They can actually do this now. They can take their, as you all know, the process of digitalization resulted in ability to multicast multiple signals, multiple channels of television. As a consequence of this, they have more channels, they have more spectrum than they need just to provide at least a standard conventional broadcast service, not necessarily high definition. The FCC allows them to use this to provide non-broadcast, quote, auxiliary services, or actually to allow third persons, lease it to other third persons to provide that auxiliary service. But it is subject to the condition that they continue to provide one standard conventional video program service. So they cannot, under present law, simply willy-nilly transfer their entire channel to a non-broadcast service. One can even imagine going further than this, however. One might imagine the FCC, or at least Congress, I'm not a little skeptical about FCC being able to do it, allowing selective transfers by marginal stations in large markets. There are a variety of other ways of tweaking the existing table of allotments. You could fuss with the interference standards, the mileage separation requirements, and a variety of other things, and maybe retrieve a few extra channels out of the broadcast table to give to mobile wireless. But I think it would be extraordinary for this FCC, for the FCC that we've seen over the last 60 years, at least, 70 years, to all of a sudden ditch what it has long adhered to as the true and only heaven of regulatory policy, namely localism, in order to encourage the growth of mobile wireless. For just such reason, I think it's doubtful that the broadcast industry itself would endorse such a proposal, even though there might be substantial economic gains from trade that have that authority. And the reason is that if the proposal failed, then the broadcasters would be politically exposed. Suddenly, where are they going to make a claim, a credible claim, that they need the protection that they now receive against, say, cable television and satellite broadcasters in order to protect local service? This is the same service from which they were about ready to cash it in. So I think it would be politically dicey, to say the least. for either the FCC or the broadcast.